Welcome to this episode of Church Helpdesk. I'm Will McKay. I work with the evangelism and church health team of the Arkansas Baptist State Convention. And I am joined here with two of my friends. And we are here today to talk about budgets, budgeting, how to close out a year, how to plan, and really excited about the conversation. I have with me Laramie LeCue. Laramie works with our evangelism and church health team as well. Has served as an associate pastor, has served as a senior pastor at multiple churches.
Yes, sir.
Patrick Henry as well, seminary trained, layperson for a while, called to ministry later, a little bit later in life.
Right.
And so layperson, lay ministry, and then served as a ministry pastor on staff, and then as an executive pastor. Now you work with the Arkansas Baptist Foundation.
Correct.
All right, so a lot of different experiences and capacities represented here at the table. Laramie, you said just a minute ago, I'm a preacher at heart, I don't math.
That's correct, yeah.
A lot of pastors and people in ministry feel that way.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts? What are your feelings when budget season rolls around in ministry?
Well, the reason I say preachers don't math, the old term ministerially speaking, we look at a room of 50 and we say, oh, there's 400 or 500 here today, so we don't math well, but seriously, when it comes to church budget, I kind of try to look as we get toward year end and just begin to pray and think through where are we financially, but also where are we ministerially? Is there an area that God has really worked financially that I see Him blessing and people are really engaged in? Are there areas in our church ministerially that have really taken things to a new level, that God is really at work in that area of our church? So as we plan for the next year, it kind of begins to paint the landscape of where we may need to make adjustments, either an increase or decrease, and just kind of try to get a feel for the lay of the land. Where are we financially? Where are we ministerially?
Yeah, and when you start talking finances sometimes with pastors, it gets sticky pretty quick because, kind of one of the unfortunate sides of ministry is it takes money to pull off.
That's right.
We know that God is sufficient.
Yeah.
We know that He needs none of our resources.
Right.
But we also know that He chooses to work through those many times.
That's right.
And it can be a little bit of a challenging situation. Yeah. So you're on the kind of the senior pastor side of that. Patrick, you've been on the other side. You've been the executive guy who is trying to work through a budget with a senior pastor.
Right.
What's that like?
It's fun. It's exciting. For a guy that lives in that world, that's a big part of our season. A big part of what we do is work on the budget when it's that time. But what I would say is through that experience, what I've learned is to do a lot of research. Just look at the season you've been through with your church. We use the term trailing 52. Look back at the last 52 weeks of your giving. What does that look like? And ultimately, what you're trying to do is come to a number with your budget, the number that you want to call your budget. And so that takes time. It takes some research. But you also want to have those conversations with your pastors, your staff, to give the mission to that budget. It's not just a number. There's a mission, a kingdom mission behind the budget. So there's a lot of things that go into finding that number, but the idea is that you work together and you do your research and the math and you do all the right calculations and you come up with a number that you feel led to go after.
So in a lot of the pastors who are going to watch this, they may be at churches that don't have the liberty of having an executive pastor.
Right.
In lieu of that kind of person on the team, who would you encourage them to involve in the budget conversation?
Yeah, hopefully you have a finance committee or a treasurer or someone that has that knowledge that can help you with the terminology and what to do and where to look and how to gain that knowledge of where you're at as a church. The idea is to really work to get that number because you don't want to just grab a number and try. You want to do some research and allow someone to help you, or even call in the convention or the foundation to ask someone, hey, I need some help with this, or maybe you have a church member that's able to help you walk through that season.
Right. So a good budget planning period.
Right.
Is how long? From the time you start thinking about the next year until the time that it's voted on, About how much time did you typically spend on that?
We would spend about 6 months. So we would start.
And so here we are doing this video in October.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if you haven't started,
Now's a really good time.
Now's a great time to start. Yeah. So
6
yeah,
months.
it's a long process of really on the executive pastor side of things. You're looking at the history of your budget. You're looking at giving closely to try and project what that number is. So there's a lot of work that goes in it behind the scenes. So on the executive pastor side, there's a lot of work going into it. You'll start in May, June, July, August. You start bringing people together to formulate what that number might look like for the next year, in this case 2021. Then you pull your teams together and say, all right, I need you to tell me what you need for the next year. All right, then you pull your finance committee together, and those guys work with you in putting a budget together. It gets presented to the church. It gets voted on, October, November, December-ish, depending on what your calendar year looks like, what your fiscal year looks like. But then it's voted on, and then, you start your new budget.
Talk to me about communicating with the congregation. Laramie, what did that look like from presenting to the congregation, having meetings? What would you say when you look back at your pastorates? What are some things that work well for you, or things that you would even do differently now that you're in the role that you're in?
I think when it comes to stewardship, there's some principles that seem to abide. The what gets celebrated gets repeated.
That's good.
Principle. And so if we're celebrating the wins financially, you're celebrating the fact that God's people have been faithful to give, and tithe regularly, sacrificially, and so to celebrate those things. I also think that stewardship is something that you have to be strategic and repetitive, because building a culture of stewardship is not something as simple as having a stewardship emphasis one weekend. You're going to have stewardship emphasis built in multiple times a year and do it every single year, because reality is, if your church is a growing, healthy church, you're not doing those stewardship emphasis with the same people year in, year out. Right. You're reaching new people, and so as you're reaching new families, new people, well, they don't know that they're supposed to tithe, they don't know how to tithe. And so, I think celebrating it, doing it strategically, being repetitive about that, but then also when it comes to financial matters as a pastor, I always wanted to be transparent. I wanted there to be a healthy chain of accountability, and I wanted my church people to know this is how money is taken up, this is how it's counted, this is how it's deposited, this is how it's budgeted, this is how it's spent, all of these things, so that there's just a trust. Because if people don't trust that you're stewarding God's money well, they're not gonna give the way that they could or should, because they're not sure what's going to happen with it and how it's being managed. And so I feel like transparency, celebrating the wins, being consistent and repetitive in those stewardship emphasis. And so then as it applies to communicating the actual budget that will be presented, I always wanted to make sure that the right people laid hands and eyes on it before the actual meeting of the church, kind of those meetings before the meetings, because I felt like, ultimately it's a church vote. But if you're able to present the budget and say this comes as a motion, a second from the stewardship team, the finance team, whatever it's called, but then you're also able to say, the deacons and staff are also in approval of presenting this budget. I feel like as your church people hear, okay, there's transparency there, because this isn't something that was done in a corner and then is kind of presented, and we're trying to pass $1 million budget that's got 4 item lines on it, so I think transparency,
You mentioned
consistency.
You mentioned the right people. I just want to get some clarification on that. Are you talking about these secretive people that kind of lurk in the shadows, that are big names in the community? Who are right people?
I think the ministerial staff are right people. I think lay leaders who are influential in the church. I feel like churches, the majority of our churches in Arkansas are 200 or less. And in churches that size, they are led through key relationships with influential people. And so there's a lot of people in church that they want to know what the pastor thinks about the budget, but they also want to know what this man thinks about
How
the
many
budget.
meetings did you have prior to the budget vote? Did you do congregational meetings?
Yeah.
How many did y'all have a set number that you would do?
So we just did quarterly meetings as a
Okay.
congregation.
And so you tied it in with the quarterly meeting.
Yeah, there would be a financial report every single quarterly meeting, kind of showing where we are, what money's being spent on, how we're doing, in all aspects of ministry and finance. So then whenever we get to the end of year meeting where we present the budget, where we are financially is not a surprise.
Okay. Right.
Yeah.
Okay. The church I came from, the congregation received the budget 2 weeks out.
Okay.
They had 2 meetings, which they had the opportunity to participate or not, ask questions, and then the vote typically took place one time in a quarterly meeting, and then I think there were a couple of times when it took place at the end of a Sunday service.
Yeah.
But yeah, that just goes to aid communication. Another piece that we started doing, we really tried to utilize the offering time to take a minute or two to tell the story, how these dollars are being spent, if there's a mission trip or a camp, and make sure that we took the opportunity to say we're able to do this because you give faithfully and sacrificially.
It's good.
We tied in for years before I got there. There was a debt payoff. They had been through 3 capital campaigns to pay off a building that was built about 10 years prior. And great building in use, but they were doing these 3-year campaigns that were outside of the budget. And man, praise the Lord for godly leaders and folks that are there. Said, man, I think we can pay this off more aggressively if we wrap it into the budget. And so we tied it into the budget and came up with some language that kind of became sticky, that people started repeating, that if we will tithe, all of our needs will be met and we'll pay off our debt. Right? And so a little jingle.
Yeah.
And at first folks would laugh about it and then start repeating it. Next thing you know, you've got church leaders that are presenting, and about the time you get tired of saying something, they're just picking it up and starting to repeat.
That's correct.
And I want to say over the course of a year and a half, we were able to knock it down from about 1.2 million to about 600,000. And that was, by far more aggressive. And it was just because everything was tied in. People knew that when they tithed, that some of it was going here, that it was going towards missions, that it was going toward programming at the church, all of it together. And so being able to tell the story kind of makes that one-stop shop. One of the tendencies sometimes is for folks to designate towards the things they're passionate about. And if we can encourage folks, when you give it to here, everything gets taken.
Right.
Because when folks start to designate, all of a sudden it takes away from other ministries that would continue to go on. If we all designated, we'd all be in a world of hurt.
Right.
So these are normal conversations that people are having as a year ends and another begins. How has COVID affected that this year? How has the coronavirus how would it affect the considerations you would be having as a pastor and an executive pastor as you wrap up one year and start another?
Yeah, one of the things that I would say early on is have the conversation. Be real with your current situation. So there's no doubt we're in the middle of a pandemic. Nobody knows when it's going to end. We first guessed Easter, right? And then we said, well, maybe summer. And now here we are nearing Thanksgiving, and still it's here, and it's not going anywhere, I don't think. But my first piece of advice would be to remain optimistic, number one. And according to recent reports from the ECFA, they tell us that churches across the country are seeing increased giving. Giving has been really good for churches, and I've experienced that, even with churches in our state and churches that I've been a part of, is that giving has been really good.
Okay, so and we know that's not everybody, but let's take that for a moment. Let's say that someone watching this is at a church where giving has been up, that there's a surplus. A lot of churches went ahead and they cut their budgets.
Sure.
There was a lot of programming that didn't happen, so maybe their expenses are down, and they're seeing a surplus at the end of this year.
Right.
How would you encourage them to be thinking about stewarding that?
Yeah, so the first thing I would do is take a hard look at where you are holistically. Do you have debt? That's something that you would want to consider with some surplus. But also, do you have any reserves? Let's think about, say this happens again, next year or 10 years down the road. Let's be smart and let's put some of that away. And let's.
How many months? How many months does a church
Depends
need?
on who you ask, but
Yeah.
anywhere from 3 to 6 months. So you take your monthly expenses, for the year, divide it by 12, and they say that times 3 or 6. You get a number and you shoot for it. Set a goal of, say you don't have any right now. You don't have any reserves. Try to get 2 to 3 months worth of reserves, just to sitting like an operating reserve, just to sit there.
Yeah.
So when something like this happens again,
Okay.
you've got something to hold on to.
So let's say the church, good on reserves, they got 6 months worth,
Yeah.
got $40,000 surplus.
Yeah, then you start looking at your debt. Again, if you don't have any debt,
No debt.
no debt, then if there are capital needs that you need to get done, some things you've seen that you want to get done, then that's what you do with those things. Take care of some capital expenditures, lighting. I'm just trying to think of
Sure.
anything you might have that you wanted to get done for a while. But also, the first thing I'm going to say is save, is put that off to the side until we see what happens in 2021 and what the
Yeah.
next year might look like. But
Laramie, as a senior pastor, we're not faced with those kind of situations often.
Right.
What are you thinking about on the ministry side about how best to steward those dollars? Of course, now, we're going to pray about this.
Right.
What are some of those obvious biblical considerations that you would have in mind
Yeah.
in ministry?
So I think one, along with what Patrick said, I would not spend it on something non-essential.
Right.
I also would not budget on it for the next year. But I would take a look at, if there's no debt, if, our facility and some of those capital needs are okay, then I'm going to begin to look at ministries that we are attached to. Like if we're connected to a ministry in Guatemala, is there something that ministry needs that we might could help provide? Is there something that, the Arkansas Baptist Children's Home needs that we could help provide? So I'm going to begin to look, if we look internally, we say we have no debt, we have a surplus, we're okay here, there's nothing non-essential that we have to be about, that I'm going to begin to look at some of those ministries that we are attached to, see if we might be a financial blessing to some of them, because some of them say it's a camp. Well, they didn't have camp this summer. So where we may have a surplus in budget, they may have a deficit in budget. So I'm going to begin to look at some of those ministries that we're attached to see if what has been a positive thing for us financially has been a negative thing for them, see if we might be able to invest and pour back
Well,
into
you've
those
got
ministries.
International Mission Board.
Yeah.
You've got NAM, you've got
That's right.
Dixie Jackson for
That's
church
right.
planting and disaster relief
Right.
here in the state. I mean, there are a lot of needs that hopefully we're keeping before our folks on a regular basis
Yeah.
anyway.
Right.
yeah, it's a great point on being able to be a great example to your church as a leader, to say,
Yeah.
Lord's blessed us. Now we have the opportunity to help
Yeah.
and give back,
Right,
maybe
right.
in your community or whatever. So yeah, great point. So something to obviously look at.
Let's say that it's the other way around. We're finishing out this year and folks are either struggling to break even or maybe there's even a deficit.
Yeah.
First of all, because we do hear stories
Sure.
about churches that are in good places financially, does it mean that there's necessarily wrong with a church or a pastor if they're in a different, if they have a deficit right now?
Sure. Yeah, no, that's if you have a deficit, then there are obviously hard conversations, things you've got to look at at a different level. You've got to get real with where you are and go back, and I would say not be scared to go and find the problem. I mean, you've got to find out what happened. If it's giving, that's one thing, or if it's, a budget issue, that's another thing, or something that stands out. Go back and try and find out what happened and correct it. If it's a budget issue, correct it with the next year's budget. If there's a way for you to go and renegotiate, say it's a bad contract within the church or something, or renegotiate a loan or a lease or something like that. Look for those things to get, be proactive and try and cut that deficit down in the next year. But face it head on and address it, whatever it is. Let's find it and let's fix it.
For sure.
All right, so and that's one side of it. How would you budget? Let's say church is struggling, they're hoping to maybe break even in best case scenario, maybe they're down. How would you be planning? I know there's a lot of factors,
Sure.
but what are some general rules that you would give in adjusting for the uncertainty of next year?
Yeah, I would say number one, go back and, like I said earlier, try and figure out what that number is. Look at your giving closely and get some help. If the foundation can help with that, or anybody at the convention can help with that, allow us to help you look back and see what that number is, what your giving is, and establish some patterns. And then from that, look at your trends and see what that number actually is. So let's get a real number one. Let's see what people are giving from the first 9 months of the year and then the last quarter of last year. Let's see what that giving looks like. Let's grab a number and let's budget accordingly. Now, this is not mine, but this is a principle that was shared with me a couple of years ago, is let's budget 90% of what we brought in that year. So
Build some cushion.
Yep. So let's create some margin right away. So say you brought in $100,000 for 2020. Then let's budget $90,000 next year and put that off to the side. Don't budget it. Just keep it there. And if you have margin at the end of the year, then you go back to the previous conversation we just had, and then you have some ideas on what you might do with that margin. But or set it as a goal to get down to that 90%. Say it's 95% or whatever, but certainly don't go over. Man, I see churches all the time. They don't make their number, but they want to do more, so they say, "Hey, let's set it higher." No, let's not use that number.
Right.
Let's be real and let's be honest and let's face it, and let's make some cuts. Find your budget and make the cuts that are necessary to make, and get a real number.
You've served as a pastor. You've had to have those conversations. What tips would you give to pastors in having hard conversations about money? What language are you using or not? Where? Are these pulpit conversations or are these deacons meeting conversations? How are you addressing that?
Yeah, I think I probably would not address it from the pulpit first. I'm going to have some discussions with people just to consider: is this a stewardship issue? Like, is giving down because of the pandemic and the economy, or is this a stewardship issue on our part because we've kind of been frivolous in our spending? We've kind of gotten used to excess, and so we've just kind of budgeted things that aren't really essential. You kind of also have to take a hard look and say, are we overstaffed in some situations? Because I think there has been a tendency in some churches, even where I've served, if there was a need, then we just, created a position, hired somebody to do it, So I kind of have to, take a hard look at those things. And then I begin to have, those tough conversations with deacons and my key leaders. I'm going to consult even some people in my church who may be lay leaders who are financial professionals of sorts. I feel like it's a good leadership principle, to consider, are there people around me who are good and strong in areas where I'm not? And so if I have people who are gifted and used to working with finances, then I'm going to consult them on, what's the market doing? What's the economy doing? What should we expect next year? And so I think I would start those conversations internally amongst the leadership, ministerial leadership, lay leadership, and then if those conversations need to go to another level, then we begin to maybe have, I would have from time to time what I call church family meetings on a Sunday evening. I'd just come in, I'd put a stool out front. We wouldn't have an agenda. It wouldn't be a business meeting. We wouldn't vote on anything. I would have some items for discussion. And so, at that point, then I might go to the church family and say, here's some decisions that we need to pray about for next year, and just kind of get some feedback from them, because I have learned that, one, the best ideas don't always come from me, and two, sometimes the best idea is not any one person's idea, but kind of a combination of our ideas. And so just kind of let everybody kind of collaborate into that a little bit. But I would do it in that order. I would start internally, and then once we feel like we've identified some areas where trimming can be done, then maybe take those issues to the church and let them speak into some of those things.
That's good. Yeah, timing and delivery are critical when it comes to communicating about money. Because at the end of the day, it is a gift of grace when a dollar comes in.
That's right.
In that offering plate. And so
That's right.
You certainly don't want to shame people for not, meeting those expectations. Try to stay optimistic and positive.
Sure.
Keep that big vision in front of them and trust the Lord. And I think that leads to the last question I'll have for you guys. What biblical truths did you rely on as you went through the biblical process? What are some of those sustaining principles that you get from Scripture that have helped you, or that would be a word of encouragement for those that are walking through this season right now?
Yeah, for me, a lot of the time, what I spent trying to encourage people to do is to be a cheerful giver. And I mean, I think it's 2 Corinthians 9, somewhere in there, you're going to find Paul talking about that we are to be giving from the joy of our heart and to be a cheerful giver. And that's something that's really hard. That's something that's taught. It's also modeled, from the church's perspective and from your leadership. So it's something that we always really try to encourage people. Number one, the Bible tells us that we're to give. We know that. But their attitude in giving and encouraging people to give, such a hard conversation sometimes, but we all know it's a conversation we have to have. But it's like you were talking about earlier, just little things here, even saying, because you give, we as a church are able to do this. That's something that is so important and key and can really change the dynamic of your church and how they give and their attitude towards giving. So for me, trying to teach that the heart behind giving, because it is a hard issue.
Yes, it is. Yes,
and so if we can teach them to be a cheerful giver, that makes a big difference.
Well, and as a pastor at heart, yes, it's a discipleship issue.
Right.
And the tendency sometimes is to just see it merely as money and financial, and I'm uncomfortable getting into people's pocketbooks. But where your treasure is, there your heart will be also.
That's right.
It's an indicator. So as a pastor, Laramie, what are some of those for you?
Well, I think you hit on it earlier. We talk about in life those teachable moments. And I think as a pastor, if you are passing up the opportunity to take a minute before you take the offering up and teach and speak into that, you're missing a teachable moment week after week after week. As Patrick said, that there's a lot that the Bible has to say. The Bible has a ton of material on money and finances. 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and 9 is the longest discourse in Scripture on financial matters, and so it's just full Old Testament and New Testament. And so I don't think there's anything wrong with taking that minute before the offering as the ushers are coming, and maybe reading a passage of Scripture that's on financial matters, on stewardship, and then connecting the dots for them. This is what the Bible says about stewardship. Because you give, this is what we're able to do. This is the kingdom picture, and you continue to just drill down there and paint that picture for them. And so, I think that so whenever it comes to stewardship, helping them see that it is a matter of the heart. I think Jesus said, "Where your heart is, where your treasure is, that's where your heart is." I think it was Martin Luther that said, "If the Lord has a man's heart, He'll have a man's purse." I always tell him, "Now we don't carry purses today, all right? But we say if He has your heart, He'll have your checkbook, okay, your wallet." That's right.
It's wallet in English.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, I think those are very good. I think sometimes there's a tendency for people to think that when planning, that if we increase our budget during a time like this, people think we're stupid. If we decrease it, they'll think we don't have much faith.
Yeah.
I think what's important is to do it all in faith. I mean, with over almost 1,600 churches around Arkansas, every situation is going to be different.
That's right.
And the key for a pastor and for a leadership team is to understand what God is doing in this context.
Right.
How can we best, considering the resources God has given us, fulfill the mission that He has for us?
right.
Yeah.
And when more people are being led, more people are going to feel called.
Sure.
That's right.
It's amazing when you involve other people in that conversation,
That's right.
how He starts to align people behind a shared vision and communicate His desires through multiple people.
That's right.
That's a sweet experience that I wouldn't want to take away from anybody.
Yeah, I just say, look at him. One of the lay people that's in one of these churches that is involved in that process may experience a call to ministry and
That's
become
right.
an executive pastor or work for the Arkansas Baptist Foundation one day.
That's right.
You never know what may happen if you begin to just let people serve according to their giftedness.
That's right.
Yeah, that's a good word to end on.
Yeah.
Laramie and Patrick, thanks for joining us.
I do it.
And thank you for joining us. This has been another edition of Church Helpdesk. We hope this has been helpful to you, and we hope to see you again soon.